The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension as Judge Naomi Carter stared down at the man seated before her. Reporters lined the back of the room, their pens poised, cameras flashing to capture the moment. The audience, filled with victims, who had lost everything, barely breathed as the judge prepared to deliver her sentence. At the defendant's table, Cameron Steele, the billionaire real estate mogul who had built his empire on deception, sat with an arrogant smirk. He had walked into this trial confident that his wealth would shield him, convinced that no black woman in a robe could hold power over him. But today his world was about to change forever. Judge Carter's voice was steady, deliberate. "Mr. Steele, I hereby sentence you to—" A collective gasp erupted through the courtroom. Cameron's smirk vanished, his face draining of color. The impossible had happened. What did Judge Carter say that left the entire nation in shock? And how did a man like Cameron Steele end up in this moment, his entire empire crumbling around him? Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you believe in justice for all, make sure to hit like and subscribe to support more stories like this one. 6 months earlier, Cameron Steele was untouchable. He was the kind of billionaire who turned everything he touched into gold, or at least that's how he sold himself to the world. A real estate mogul with properties spanning across the country, he had cultivated an image of ruthless success, gracing the covers of business magazines, speaking at elite investor conferences, and boasting about his ability to revitalize struggling neighborhoods. But beneath the polished exterior was a man whose fortune had been built on deception and exploitation, a man who had systematically displaced minority families, crushed small businesses, and manipulated city officials to ensure his continued dominance. He didn't just make money, he took it, often from those who could least afford to lose it. When a journalist from a major news outlet confronted him about the numerous accusations of discriminatory housing practices, Cameron had merely laughed. "It's just business," he said with a smirk, sipping on an expensive glass of scotch. In his high-rise Manhattan office, "If they can't keep up, they don't belong. The world isn't fair, never has been." That single interview clip went viral overnight, igniting outrage from civil rights organizations and community leaders. Protesters gathered outside Steele Towers, his flagship development, demanding accountability. But Cameron Steele wasn't concerned. Public outrage was temporary, and money always won in the end. He had seen it before. A scandal would flare up, people would shout about injustice, and then the next news cycle would come along to distract them. The system had always favored men like him, and he saw no reason why that would change now. What Cameron failed to realize was that his past was beginning to catch up with him. A whistleblower, one of his former high-level executives, had come forward with damning documents proving that Cameron had been running fraudulent real estate schemes for years. He had engaged in predatory lending, targeting Black and Latino families with misleading mortgage deals that left them trapped in financial ruin. He had bribed city officials to deny business permits to minority entrepreneurs so that he could maintain control over commercial districts. He had even manipulated property tax assessments, forcing people out of their homes under the guise of urban renewal. The documents revealed a disturbing pattern of racial discrimination, painting a picture of a man who not only profited from gentrification, but intentionally designed his business model to push out minority communities. Federal investigators seized on the evidence, launching a full-scale investigation into Steele Enterprises. A class-action lawsuit soon followed, with thousands of former homeowners, tenants, and small business owners demanding justice. Cameron, however, remained dismissive. "They won't touch me," he told his inner circle. "I've got the best lawyers money can buy." But cracks in his empire were already beginning to show. Some of his business partners, wary of the growing scrutiny, started distancing themselves from him. Investors pulled out of projects. Stock prices for Steele Enterprises plummeted. And then came the moment that changed everything. The federal indictment. The charges were staggering: wire fraud, racketeering, conspiracy, obstruction of justice. Prosecutors alleged that Cameron had not only engaged in mass fraud, but had also deliberately targeted Black and Latino families with exploitative contracts designed to fail. The case was airtight, bolstered by thousands of pages of incriminating documents and testimony from former employees who had been part of the scheme. Still, Cameron refused to acknowledge the gravity of the situation. "I've been through worse," he assured himself, lounging in his penthouse as news channels broadcast his downfall. "It's all noise, nothing sticks." What he hadn't accounted for was Judge Naomi Carter. A former civil rights attorney with a reputation for unwavering integrity, she had presided over some of the most high-profile corporate crime cases in recent years. Unlike the judges Cameron had dealt with in the past, judges who came from the same elite circles as him and were susceptible to influence, Judge Carter was different. She had spent her career fighting against systemic injustice, and she was known for her no-nonsense approach to the law. When the case was assigned to her, legal analysts speculated that Cameron's usual tactics, stalling proceedings, filing endless motions, leveraging political connections, would not work this time. Still, he wasn't worried. When Cameron arrived in court for his first hearing, he made his arrogance clear. The moment Judge Carter entered, everyone in the courtroom rose to their feet, everyone except Cameron. The act was deliberate. His attorney nudged him, whispering for him to stand, but Cameron just smirked and remained seated, casually flipping through a legal pad as if the moment was beneath him. Judge Carter didn't react, at least not immediately. But the shift in the courtroom was palpable. A murmur rippled through the audience as victims and onlookers exchanged looks of disbelief. Even the prosecution stole glances at the judge, anticipating her response. But instead of acknowledging Cameron's blatant act of disrespect, Judge Carter simply proceeded with the hearing, her expression unreadable. Outside the courtroom, the footage of Cameron refusing to stand went viral. Social media exploded with outrage. Civil rights groups decried his blatant disrespect for a Black female judge, calling it a symptom of the deep-seated entitlement that had allowed men like him to thrive unchecked for so long. The headline, "Cameron Steele refuses to stand for." Black judge dominated news cycles, with commentators dissecting the symbolism behind his actions. His legal team scrambled to control the damage, but Cameron waved them off. "They'll forget about it in a week," he scoffed. But the story didn't die down, it only grew. Inside the courtroom, Cameron continued to operate as if he were untouchable. His defense team filed motion after motion to dismiss the case, but Judge Carter shut them down one by one. The evidence was too overwhelming to ignore, and the prosecution was relentless in its pursuit of justice. They called victim after victim to the stand, each testimony painting an even more damning picture of Cameron's empire of fraud. Tanya Washington, a single mother who had lost her home after signing one of Cameron's predatory loans, testified through tears. "I begged them not to take my house," she recalled, her voice breaking. "I didn't know the contract was a scam. I just wanted a safe place for my kids." Cameron rolled his eyes as she spoke, checking his phone as if the entire trial was a waste of his time. His lack of remorse was chilling, and the audience noticed. Even the jurors shifted uncomfortably at his blatant disregard for the people he had harmed. Judge Carter, however, remained composed. She had seen men like Cameron before, men who believed wealth placed them above consequence. But she also knew that justice was coming, whether Cameron accepted it or not. As the trial continued, Cameron's world began to collapse further. His private jet was seized, his bank accounts were frozen. His once loyal employees turned against him, cutting deals with prosecutors to save themselves. But through it all, he still refused to believe that he would fall. In his mind, Judge Carter was just another obstacle, one that could be manipulated, bought, or bullied into submission. He underestimated her. What Cameron Steele didn't realize was that he wasn't just on trial for fraud. He was on trial for a lifetime of believing he was above accountability. And this time, there would be no easy way out. The first official day of Cameron Steele's trial was unlike any courtroom proceeding the city had seen in years. From the moment he arrived, the tension in the air was suffocating, as if the entire room knew that something historic was about to unfold. The media had descended on the courthouse in full force, cameras flashing, journalists jostling for position to capture every second of his arrival. Protesters lined the steps outside, holding signs demanding justice, their voices merging into a furious chant that could be heard even inside the building. But Cameron, walking through the courthouse doors in a custom-tailored suit, exuded nothing but confidence. His smirk was firmly in place, his posture relaxed, as if he were attending some exclusive social event rather than standing trial for fraud, conspiracy, and financial devastation that had ruined the lives of thousands. His legal team surrounded him like a protective shield, whispering strategy points, but he barely listened. In his mind, the outcome was already decided. He would walk away unscathed, just as he always had. Inside the courtroom, the murmurs of anticipation quieted as the bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Naomi Carter." The entire room stood as one, but Cameron Steele remained seated. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a moment of absent-mindedness. It was deliberate. He leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk playing at the corners of his lips, flipping through his legal pad with the same disinterest he might display at a tedious board meeting. His lawyer turned to him, whispering furiously, but Cameron waved him off, his arrogance on full display. Judge Carter paused at her bench, her gaze locking onto him, her face unreadable. The weight of her silence settled over the room, heavy and suffocating. The spectators exchanged glances, murmurs rippling through the crowd as disbelief registered on their faces. Even the court stenographer, whose job was to remain impartial, shifted uncomfortably. No one had ever seen such blatant disrespect inside Judge Carter's courtroom, and yet Cameron sat there, perfectly at ease, as if daring her to acknowledge his defiance. But Judge Carter said nothing. Instead, her voice remained as calm and authoritative as ever. "You may be seated." The tension in the room thickened. If Cameron had expected an immediate reaction, he didn't get one. But what no one realized in that moment was that Judge Carter had already decided how she would deal with Cameron Steele, and it would be far more devastating than a simple reprimand. As the trial began, the prosecution wasted no time painting a damning picture of Cameron's crimes. They introduced the first major piece of evidence, a series of emails in which Cameron explicitly instructed his executives to falsify loan applications, target Black and Latino homeowners with predatory lending, and evict struggling tenants in favor of wealthier clients. The emails were cold, calculating, and undeniably incriminating. One read, "If they can't afford to keep up, they don't belong here. Keep the properties white and profitable." A collective gasp echoed through the room. Some of the victims in the gallery shook their heads in disgust. Others sat in stunned silence, their expressions unreadable. But Cameron, he chuckled, a small, careless laugh, as if the evidence laid bare before the world was nothing more than an inside joke. The prosecutor, visibly taken aback, turned toward, her voice sharp. "Mr. Steele, do you recognize this email?" His attorney immediately objected, claiming that the email had already been addressed in pretrial hearings, but Judge Carter didn't hesitate. "Overruled. The defendant will answer the question." Cameron leaned into the microphone, his voice dripping with condescension. "Yes, I recognize it, but let's not pretend it means what you're implying. It's just business talk. You wouldn't understand." The words hung in the air like poison. The audience reacted immediately, murmurs of disbelief, barely restrained anger. Angela Martinez, a single mother who had lost her home due to Cameron's fraudulent loans, clenched her fists so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Judge Carter's gavel struck the bench once, the sharp crack cutting through the noise like a gunshot. "Order in the court," she commanded, her voice like steel. Then her gaze returned to Cameron, cold and unwavering. "Mr. Steele, I advise you to watch your tone. This is not a boardroom meeting." For the first time, something flickered in Cameron's expression. Annoyance. He had expected a reaction, but he hadn't expected her to keep complete control over the situation. His usual tactics, so arrogance, belittling those around him, asserting his dominance, weren't working here. But instead of adjusting, he doubled down. As the prosecution continued to present its case, calling victim after victim to the stand, Cameron made no attempt to hide his contempt. He rolled his eyes, whispered jokes to his attorney, and, in some instances, outright ignored the testimony being given. When Angela Martinez took the stand, her voice trembling as she recalled the moment she and her children were forced out of their home with nowhere to go, Cameron barely glanced at her. When Peter Vaughn, a retired firefighter who had lost his life savings investing in one of Cameron's fraudulent schemes, told his heartbreaking story of having to move into his brother's spare room at the age of 60, Cameron checked his phone. It was a moment that did not go unnoticed. The prosecutor, her patience already worn thin, turned sharply toward the judge. "Your Honor, the defendant is clearly not paying attention to the witness." All eyes snapped toward Judge Carter. She said nothing at first. Then slowly, deliberately, she leaned forward. "Mr. Steele," she said, her voice measured but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. "Put your phone away. Now." Cameron didn't even look up at first. He merely smirked, holding up the phone slightly as if to justify his actions. "I was just checking something important," he said lazily. The room fell completely silent. The tension was so thick it felt as if the entire courtroom was holding its breath. Then Judge Carter's voice hardened. "I said now." For a brief moment it looked as if Cameron might argue. His arrogance, his entitlement, his sheer belief in his own invincibility made it nearly impossible for him to grasp that for once he was not the one in control. But something in Judge Carter's unwavering gaze made him reconsider. With exaggerated slowness, he set the phone down on the table. The damage, however, had already been done. Angela Martinez, still sitting on the witness stand, let out a small, disbelieving laugh, not of amusement, but of sheer disbelief that even after everything he had done, Cameron still didn't care. The audience whispered among themselves, their reactions ranging from outrage to pure disgust. Even some members of Cameron's own legal team shifted uncomfortably, as if realizing that defending him had just become significantly harder. The next few days of the trial continued in much the same way. Witness after witness testified against Cameron, painting a horrifying picture of fraud, manipulation, and racially motivated displacement. But his behavior didn't change. Then came the final blow of the prosecution's case, a secret recording obtained from one of Cameron's former executives. In it, Cameron could be heard laughing as he discussed how easy it was to exploit Black and Latino families. "They don't fight back. That's the beauty of it. Give them a few complicated legal terms and they'll sign anything." The courtroom gasped. One of the jurors, a young black woman, clenched her jaw so tightly that the muscles in her face twitched. Even some of the reporters looked visibly shaken. But Cameron? He smirked. Again. Judge Carter, however, did not react immediately. She simply watched him, her expression unreadable. But those who had followed her career closely recognized that look. It was the look she gave when she had already made up her mind. What would happen next? Would Cameron finally be forced to acknowledge the weight of his actions? Or would his arrogance push him further into the abyss? Comment number 1, if you believe Cameron's actions are beyond redemption, and let us know. Do you think Judge Carter should hold him in contempt of court for his blatant disrespect? And if you want to see how this trial takes a turn that no one expects, make sure to like and subscribe for the next part of this gripping story. The trial continued, and with each passing day, Cameron Steele's confidence began to waver, though he refused to show it. His smirk, once an unshakable mask of arrogance, faltered ever so slightly as the prosecution dismantled his empire piece by piece. The courtroom was no longer just a stage for him to display his dominance. It had become a battlefield where every piece of evidence, every witness testimony, was another strike against him. The prosecution presented a meticulously built case, revealing a mountain of documents that exposed Cameron's fraudulent dealings in explicit detail. Bank records showed millions siphoned from falsely promised investments, shell companies created to hide funds, and a tangled web of financial deceit that stretched back over a decade. His schemes had devastated entire communities, particularly Black and Latino families, who had been lured into signing predatory loan agreements disguised as opportunities to achieve homeownership. Prosecutors displayed spreadsheets detailing how his company had intentionally adjusted loan terms to make sure payments skyrocketed after a year, knowing full well that most families wouldn't be able to keep up. The evidence was damning, but the real blow came when they unveiled a private recording of Cameron himself, discussing his business practices with his top executives. In the crackling audio, Cameron's voice was unmistakable, laced with mockery and indifference. "We're not running a charity," he scoffed. "If they don't read the fine print, that's their problem. They'll either pay or they'll get out. And if they can't afford it, then maybe they shouldn't have tried to play in the big leagues. It's simple math. If you can't swim, you sink." His words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. One of the jurors, a middle-aged black man, shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. Angela Martinez, sitting among the other victims, shook her head in disbelief. Cameron, however, sat motionless, his smirk barely visible, his fingers tapping against the table in forced nonchalance. But everyone could see the tension in his shoulders, the slight narrowing of his eyes. For the first time, reality was pressing in on him. The prosecution called their next witness, a former Steele Enterprises executive, Robert Caldwell, who had once been one of Cameron's closest confidants. Caldwell had taken a plea deal in exchange for his testimony, and as he sat on the witness stand, his demeanor was somber. He was a man who had once profited from Cameron's schemes, but had now turned against him in a desperate bid to save himself. "I was there when he made those decisions," Caldwell admitted, his voice thick with regret. "I helped carry them out, but I can't sit here and pretend I didn't know what we were doing. We targeted Black and Latino homeowners because Cameron believed they were the least likely to fight back. He said, and I quote, 'They don't have the resources or the connections. They'll take what we give them.'" The courtroom erupted into whispers, some of them barely restrained exclamations of fury. Judge Carter's gavel struck once, and silence fell. But the weight of Caldwell's words lingered. Cameron didn't react. He didn't roll his eyes this time or chuckle under his breath. He simply sat there, his smirk gone, his fingers tightening around the edges of his chair. As the prosecution continued to present their case, they revealed a collection of internal company memos, all bearing Cameron's signature, instructing his team to deliberately mislead minority tenants. The memos included directives to delay responses to tenant complaints in specific buildings and to hold eviction notices until the last possible moment to prevent families from having time to fight back. One particularly damning document instructed employees to only approve applications from white tenants in specific high-value properties, ensuring that wealthier white residents replaced Black and Latino families in gentrifying neighborhoods. The evidence was overwhelming. Every paper, every file, every email added another nail to Cameron's coffin. And yet, even as the walls closed in around him, Cameron refused to acknowledge reality. He whispered to his lawyer, gesturing with casual indifference, as if all of this was simply an inconvenience, a speed bump on his road back to power. But his lawyer looked strained, his responses clipped. The usual confidence in Cameron's defense team had begun to erode. They could see it now, the inevitable outcome, that Cameron refused to accept. Still, he clung to his arrogance. Then came the moment that shattered what little control Cameron still thought he had. The prosecution called Tanya Washington to the stand, a mother of 3 who had been evicted from her home after unknowingly signing one of Cameron's predatory contracts. Her voice was steady, but the pain in her words was undeniable. "I trusted his company," she said, her eyes locked onto Cameron. "I thought I was finally giving my kids a chance at stability. We weren't asking for a handout. We just wanted a home. But the contract was a lie. The payments doubled after a year, and when I called to ask why, They told me there was nothing they could do. My children and I spent 6 months living out of my car because of him. The room was silent, every eye trained on Cameron. But he didn't flinch, he didn't even look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the table in front of him, as if he could will her testimony away. Angela Martinez was next, her story just as devastating. "I worked 3 jobs to keep up with those payments," she said, her voice shaking. "I begged them to work with me. I told them I just needed a little more time. But all I got was an eviction notice and a message that said, 'We don't negotiate.'" Her eyes flicked to Cameron. "Was that your policy, Mr. Steele? Not negotiating with people like me?" Finally, Peter Vaughn, the retired firefighter, who had lost everything in Cameron's investment scam, stepped forward. His hands shook as he held up the letter Steele Enterprises had sent him. "I spent my life running into burning buildings," he said quietly. "I spent 30 years saving people's homes, only to have mine taken away by a man who never risked anything a day in his life." His gaze locked onto Cameron, and this time, Cameron finally looked up. For a split second, something flashed across his face. Annoyance, maybe even a flicker of shame, but then it was gone. He straightened his tie, exhaled through his nose, and leaned back in his chair, as if he were bored, as if none of this mattered, and that was his final mistake. 3. Jury saw it. The audience saw it. The judge saw it. There was no remorse, no regret, no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. Cameron Steele was not just guilty. He was unrepentant. As the prosecution rested its case, the weight of the evidence was impossible to ignore. Even the media, who had once painted Cameron as a brilliant but controversial businessman, now turned against him. Headlines shifted from "Corporate Titan Faces Trial" to "Arrogant Mogul Laughs at Victim's Pain." Public opinion, once divided, now leaned almost entirely in favor of seeing him face the full weight of justice. Cameron's lawyers scrambled to build a defense, but it was already too late. The courtroom had seen the real Cameron Steele, not the charming mogul, not the business genius, but the ruthless predator who saw human lives as numbers on a spreadsheet. And though he didn't know it yet, his fate was already sealed. As the trial moved forward, Cameron Steele's arrogance only intensified, but beneath the surface, cracks were forming. His legal team was beginning to realize that no amount of money, manipulation, or courtroom theatrics could erase the sheer weight of evidence stacking against him. The media had turned fully against him, with headlines now describing him as the predator of Wall Street and the man who destroyed families for profit. Social media erupted with clips of his smirking indifference, fueling even greater outrage. But Cameron, blind to the shifting tide, continued to behave as if this trial was nothing more than a formality, a temporary inconvenience on his inevitable return to power. Every morning as he arrived at the courthouse, he strutted past protesters as if they didn't exist, ignoring the families he had destroyed, brushing off the chants demanding justice. His confidence was unshaken until the moment the courtroom became his personal downfall. On the 4th day of the trial, the defense attempted to counter the damning testimonies by discrediting the victims. Cameron's lead attorney, a seasoned corporate lawyer with a history of defending the wealthy elite, stood before the jury, painting Cameron as the true victim. "My client is a self-made man," he declared, "a businessman who has been unfairly villainized by a system eager to tear down success. Is it a crime to make money? Is it illegal to expect people to read the contracts they sign?" He paced in front of the jury, his voice filled with the controlled confidence of a man who had played this game before. These so-called victims had choices. They signed those agreements, they accepted the terms. Now, they want to blame my client for their own financial failures? The argument was clear. Cameron Steele wasn't a criminal. He was an opportunist. But then, something happened that the defense hadn't anticipated. Judge Naomi Carter, who had remained mostly silent throughout the trial except to maintain order, finally spoke. Her voice was even, measured, but the authority in her words sent a shiver through the room. "Mr. Grayson, are you suggesting that fraud is acceptable if the victim is unable to catch it?" The attorney hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "Your Honor, I'm merely pointing out that—" Judge Carter cut him off. "Because what I see before me is overwhelming evidence that Mr. Steele deliberately misled these people, that he intentionally structured these agreements to ensure their failure, that he used his wealth and power to manipulate a system that was never designed to protect people like them. And instead of taking accountability, he mocks them. So, again, I ask you, are you suggesting that this is acceptable behavior?" The defense attorney swallowed hard. He knew there was no right answer. He knew that with every word Judge Carter spoke, the jury was being reminded of the real issue at hand. Cameron, meanwhile, shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. For the first time in this trial, he looked uncomfortable. But then, in an act that stunned even his own lawyers, Cameron did something unthinkable. He laughed. It was quiet at first, a low chuckle, but in the silence of the courtroom, it felt deafening. He leaned back in his chair, shaking his head as if this entire situation was beneath him. The room froze. The victims, the jury, the press, everyone turned toward him in disbelief. Even his own legal team paled, realizing the full extent of his arrogance. Judge Carter, however, remained still. "Mr. Steele," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "Is something funny?" Cameron shrugged, his smirk returning. "I just think it's cute," he said, his voice laced with condescension. "Everyone here pretending like they actually care about justice. We all know how this ends. I pay a fine, I walk out of here, and in 6 months this is all forgotten. That's how the world works, Your Honor, no offense." The silence that followed was suffocating. The jury stared at him, their expressions shifting from neutrality to barely restrained disgust. The audience gasped, some murmuring under their breath. But it was Angela Martinez sitting in the front row who finally broke the silence. "Unbelievable," she whispered, shaking her head. "He still thinks he's untouchable." Peter Vaughn, the retired firefighter, crossed his arms. "Not for long," he muttered. The tension in the room reached a breaking point, and Judge Carter, with all the quiet authority she had wielded since day one, made her move. She turned to the bailiff. "Mr. Steele is in contempt of court," she said, her voice sharp but controlled. "Take him into custody for the remainder of the trial." Gasps filled the room. Even Cameron's smirk faltered. His lawyer jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly inappropriate." "Sit down, Mr. Grayson," Judge Carter said, her voice like steel. "Mr. Steele has repeatedly disrespected this court, the victims, and the integrity of these proceedings. He will spend the rest of this trial in holding." 2 bailiffs approached, but Cameron remained seated, his arrogance turning into something more dangerous. Rage. "You can't do this," he snapped. "I'm Cameron Steele. I built half of this city." He turned to his attorney. "Do something." But his lawyer didn't move. He knew better. He knew that arguing now would only make things worse. Instead, he simply exhaled, shook his head, and sank back into his chair. And then, for the first time since the trial began, Cameron Steele was no longer in control. The bailiffs flanked him, their hands resting on his arms, and as they pulled him to his feet, the entire room watched with a stunned, almost electric energy. This was the moment the tide officially turned. This was the moment Cameron Steele realized money couldn't save him this time. As he was escorted out of the courtroom, reporters scrambled to capture every second of it. Cameras flashed, microphones were raised, and within minutes the footage of his removal was everywhere. News outlets aired the clip on repeat. The once untouchable billionaire, now nothing more than a man in handcuffs, his power slipping through, his fingers like sand. Social media exploded. "Karma finally caught up," one user wrote. "Judge Carter just did what no one else dared to." But for the victims sitting in that courtroom, it was more than just a headline. It was proof that justice was still possible. Tanya Washington sat back in her seat, tears in her eyes, and whispered, "It's finally happening." But the trial wasn't over yet. Cameron Steele still had one final card to play. His legal team, desperate and cornered, was about to unveil a defense strategy so outrageous, so unprecedented, that it would leave the entire courtroom stunned. Could it possibly save him? Or was this the final chapter in his long history of deception? Comment number 1 if you believe Cameron Steele finally got what he deserved, or if you think there's still more justice to be served. And if you want to see how his final act of desperation plays out, make sure to like and subscribe, because you won't believe what happens next. Cameron Steele sat in the cold, gray holding cell beneath the courthouse, his hands clenched into fists, his entire body vibrating with fury. He had never been humiliated like this before. Never in his life had someone dared to put their hands on him, to drag him away like some common criminal. He had built empires. He had politicians on speed dial. He had hosted fundraisers for governors and dined with billionaires. And yet here he was, locked away like a nobody, like one of the desperate people he had spent his career stepping over. His legal team would fix this. They had to. He had paid them more money than most people would see in their lifetimes. They would get him out. They would get the judge removed. They would shut down this ridiculous trial, and when it was over, he would make sure every single person who had humiliated him today paid for it in ways they couldn't even imagine. An hour passed, then another. He refused to eat the disgusting excuse for a meal they had brought him. He refused to speak to the guards. He refused to acknowledge the reality of his situation at all. And then finally the door opened, and his lead attorney, Richard Grayson, stepped inside. Cameron shot to his feet immediately. "Get me out of here," he snapped. "This judge is out of control. I want her off the case. I want sanctions filed. I want the appeals court involved. I want—" Richard held up a hand, his expression unreadable. "Cameron, listen to me," he said, his voice lower than usual. "This isn't just about contempt anymore. Things are worse than we thought." Cameron scoffed. "Worse than me sitting in a damn holding cell?" Richard exhaled through his nose. "Yes." He stepped closer, lowering his voice even more. "They have more witnesses coming forward. People from inside your company. Some of them are cutting deals." Cameron's nostrils flared. "Who?" "Caldwell was just the first," Richard muttered. "Now, your old financial officer, Peterson, has turned, and Harris from legal. They've both flipped." Cameron's heart slammed against his ribs. Harris, the man who had personally helped him rewrite contracts to make them nearly impossible to dispute in court. If Harris was talking, that meant every secret, every cover-up, every bribe was at risk of exposure. Cameron paced the cell like a caged animal, his mind racing. "We need to stop this now," he hissed. "Find a way to shut them down." Richard hesitated. "We might still have an option," he said carefully. "But it's risky." Cameron's eyes narrowed. "What is it?" "A deal," Richard said simply, "with the prosecutor." Cameron stopped cold, staring at him. "You're joking." "Think about it," Richard pressed. "They want convictions. They want to win. They don't need to take you down for everything. If we can negotiate a plea deal, give them something, maybe a few years in a minimum security prison, pay some restitution, you could be out before the public even remembers any of this happened." Cameron clenched his jaw so hard it ached. "No," he growled. "Absolutely not." Richard sighed. "Cameron, be realistic. We're losing." "We're not losing," Cameron snapped. "We're not even playing by the right rules. These people want to see me fall? Fine, but they forget that I don't lose." His mind was already moving to a different kind of solution, one that didn't involve pleading, one that didn't involve sitting in a cell. By the time he was brought back into the courtroom the next morning, something in his demeanor had shifted. He was no longer just angry. He was calculating. He had spent the night considering his next move, and he had, finally found a way to turn this disaster in his favor. The prosecution had underestimated him. The judge had underestimated him. Even his own legal team had underestimated him. But he would remind them all exactly who he was. He sat at the defense table, his posture relaxed, his expression composed, and waited. He knew what was coming. He knew that before the day was over, they would be presenting even more evidence, more witnesses, more records, more so-called damning proof of his guilt, but they didn't know what he had done last night. What they didn't know was that in the hours after his conversation with Richard, he had made a phone call, a call to an old friend, a friend who owed him, and now that favor was coming due. The moment the prosecution introduced their next witness, Peterson, his former financial officer, the courtroom doors opened, and a man in a crisp suit stepped inside. Every head turned. The man walked straight toward the prosecution's table, whispering something to the lead prosecutor. Her expression shifted almost immediately from confidence to confusion. She leaned in, listening, then straightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. Judge Carter frowned, glancing between them. "Is there a problem?" she asked. The prosecutor exhaled slowly, then turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, we need to request an immediate recess." The defense table remained still, silent, but Cameron allowed himself the smallest of smirks. He already knew what had happened. The man he had called last night, he had just delivered the prosecution a warning that if they continued down this path, things could get very, very complicated for them. The courtroom emptied, the judge disappearing into her chambers, the attorneys filing into a separate conference room. And there, behind closed doors, Cameron's plan began to unfold. His friend had connections that reached higher than this courtroom, higher than this city. A few whispered words about how messy a full investigation could become, how politically damaging certain truths might be, how dragging this case out could lead to unexpected consequences for all involved. And suddenly, the prosecution had a lot to think about. They didn't want to lose their case, they didn't want Cameron to walk free. But if the alternative was opening doors they couldn't control, doors that led to places even they weren't prepared to go, maybe, just maybe, they would be open to negotiation. When the trial resumed hours later, there was a difference in the room. The prosecution looked rattled. Judge Carter, however, looked suspicious. She hadn't been part of the private meeting, but she knew something had happened. Her sharp eyes flickered between the attorneys, taking in their changed postures, their hesitations. And then she turned her gaze to Cameron himself. He met her eyes and smiled. It was slight, barely there, but she saw it, and she knew. Still, the trial moved forward. The prosecution continued their arguments. The witnesses testified. The evidence was presented, but something was different. The momentum had shifted. The relentless energy with which they had been pursuing him was muted. Cameron had won something last night. It wasn't full victory, not yet, but it was a crack in their certainty. And that was all he needed. As the day drew to a close, as the final witness left the stand, Cameron leaned back in his chair, his smirk returning in full force. They thought they had him, but they had no idea how far he was willing to go. The question was, how far was Judge Carter willing to go to stop him? The courtroom was eerily quiet as Judge Naomi Carter took her seat the following morning. Though no words had been exchanged, an undeniable shift had taken place. The prosecution, once relentless in their pursuit of Cameron Steele, now carried a subtle but noticeable tension. Their once unshakable confidence had been replaced with something more cautious, their movements more measured. Cameron could feel it, sense it, revel in it. He had spent years mastering the game of power, of leverage, of knowing exactly when to press and when to retreat. Last night's deal, though informal, though unspoken, had been a victory. The prosecution wouldn't drop the case entirely, not yet, but they would start pulling their punches. And once that happened, the verdict was all but certain. He would walk out of this courtroom a free man. Maybe with some restrictions, maybe with a financial penalty, but free nonetheless. His empire might take a hit, but it wouldn't crumble. His connections would see to that. His investors would return. His allies in the real estate world would rally around him, and in a year, 2 at most, he would be bigger than ever. He had already begun planning his return, imagining the headlines that would paint him as the billionaire who triumphed over the system. But Cameron had made a fatal mistake. He had underestimated her. Judge Carter adjusted her glasses, flipping through her notes as the courtroom waited. Though she had been silent, though she had shown no outward sign of distress or frustration, Cameron could feel the weight of her stare on him. He knew she saw through him. He knew she had pieced together exactly what had happened behind closed doors the day before. But what could she do about it? The law was the law, and he had played within its boundaries. He had worked the system just as he always had, bending it to his will, ensuring that justice was a privilege only granted to those with enough money to buy it. He had done nothing illegal. The bailiff stepped forward. All rise. The entire courtroom stood. Cameron hesitated for only a fraction of a second before rising as well. He didn't want to give her the satisfaction of another act of defiance. He had already won. This was a formality now. Judge Carter motioned for everyone to be seated. Then, without preamble, she spoke. "Mr. Steele," she said, her voice steady, calm, "you have been found guilty on all counts of fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The evidence against you is overwhelming. The testimonies of your victims paint a clear and disturbing picture of a man who, over the course of his career, deliberately and systematically destroyed lives in pursuit of wealth and power." Cameron exhaled slowly, already preparing himself. Here it comes. The standard speech, the usual condemnations, followed by a manageable sentence. He had expected this. But then, Judge Carter continued, and suddenly, the ground beneath him felt a little less stable. "Throughout this trial," she said, "you have shown no remorse. You have mocked this court. You have disrespected the very principles upon which our justice system stands. You have leveraged your wealth, your influence, and your connections in an attempt to escape accountability. And when faced with irrefutable evidence of your crimes, you laughed." The air in the courtroom grew heavier. Cameron's smirk wavered. "This court," Judge Carter continued, "is not blind. And while you may have spent a lifetime convincing yourself that you are above the rules that govern ordinary people, let me assure you, you are not." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The prosecution, who had entered this day uncertain, now sat up straighter, their eyes locking onto Judge Carter with something akin to hope. Cameron felt something foreign and unfamiliar begin to creep into his chest. Was this? No, it couldn't be. "Therefore," Judge Carter said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "I sentence you to 25 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole." The room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, exclamations of shock. Even the prosecution, who had assumed they would have to settle for far less, exchanged stunned glances. The audience, packed with victims who had spent years suffering under Cameron Steele's greed, burst into tears, into hushed cries of disbelief. Angela Martinez, who had spent months fearing that she would never see justice, covered her mouth with her hands. Peter Vaughn, the retired firefighter, exhaled shakily, his hands trembling, as he gripped the arms of his chair. And then Cameron stood. "No," he said, his voice sharp, controlled, demanding. "Absolutely not." He turned to his attorney. "Do something," he snapped. "Right now." Richard Grayson, who had spent decades navigating courtrooms, remained silent. His face was pale, his jaw clenched, his hands folded neatly in front of him. There was nothing to be done. This was it. Cameron turned back to the judge. "You can't do this," he said, his voice rising, barely able to contain his rage. "I'll appeal. I'll fight this. You can't—" "Mr. Steele," Judge Carter interrupted, her voice sharp. "You are no longer in control here." Her words hit like a slap. The reality of the situation finally began to sink in. Cameron's breathing quickened, his chest rising and falling. He looked at the jury, the prosecution, the rows of people watching him, waiting for him to crumble. And then, for the first time in his life, he felt powerless. The judge wasn't finished. "Furthermore," she said, her voice steady, "this court is ordering the immediate liquidation of your assets to compensate the victims of your fraudulent schemes. Every dollar you stole will be returned. Every property acquired through deceit will be redistributed. You will leave here with nothing." The courtroom exploded. Cameron staggered. He gripped the table in front of him, his knuckles white. No, he whispered. It was the first time he had ever said that word without absolute confidence that he would get his way. But it wasn't over. Bailiffs approached him. One placed a firm hand on his arm. "Don't touch me," Cameron snapped, jerking away. His voice cracked, and the room noticed. The billionaire who had strutted into this trial with an air of invincibility, the man who had spent years crushing people beneath his heel, was now panicking. He turned to the judge again, desperation creeping into his expression. "You can't do this," he repeated, but his voice lacked the authority it once held. "I'm Cameron Steele." Judge Carter's eyes remained cold, unyielding. "Not anymore," she said. The bailiffs moved in again, this time with purpose, and as they gripped his arms and began leading him away, Cameron Steele, the man who had spent his entire life believing that wealth made him untouchable, was dragged from the courtroom, powerless. The room erupted into applause, for Angela Martinez, for Peter Vaughn, for the thousands of others whose lives had been devastated by Cameron Steele's greed. This was justice. For Cameron Steele, this was the end. The courtroom had emptied, but the echoes of the verdict still reverberated through the city, stretching far beyond the walls of that grand, imposing building. Outside, the streets were alive with the murmurs of justice finally served. Reporters rushed to file their stories, microphones buzzed with analysis, and news stations broadcasted the footage of Cameron Steele being led away in handcuffs on an endless loop. The man who had once been revered, who had been feared, was now nothing more than another cautionary tale, a fallen titan who had spent his entire life believing he was untouchable, only to be undone by his own arrogance. His empire, once thought to be indestructible, was crumbling before the world's eyes, piece by piece, transaction by transaction, all of it being dismantled in the name of restitution. Angela Martinez stood at the courthouse steps, surrounded by a sea of faces, reporters, fellow victims, strangers who had come to witness the downfall of a man who had taken so much from so many. The cameras turned to her, microphones shoved toward her face, each reporter eager to capture her reaction. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she even had the words to describe what she was feeling. Relief? Yes. Justice? Maybe. But the truth was, no verdict could undo the years of suffering, the nights she had spent sleeping in her car with her children, the humiliation of begging for help, the crushing weight of hopelessness. "I feel relieved," she finally said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. "But the truth is, no sentence will erase the damage he caused. My kids and I are still rebuilding, but at least now we have hope." Nearby, Peter Vaughn spoke with an old friend, his voice carrying the weight of years spent fighting battles he never should have had to face. "It's not just about the years he's getting," he said, shaking his head, his weathered hands gripping the railing beside him. "It's about the message. People like him think they're untouchable. Today proves they're not. But for Cameron Steele, the world outside no longer existed. He was no longer the man who dictated terms from the comfort of his penthouse office, no longer the mogul who ordered the lives of thousands to be upended with the flick of a pen. He sat alone in a stark, windowless holding cell, the reality of his fate settling over him like an iron weight. He had lost everything, his wealth, his power, his influence, all gone. His assets were being seized, his bank accounts drained, his name stripped from the buildings that once bore it like a badge of honor. Even his closest allies, the ones who had profited from his schemes, had abandoned him. In the end, no amount of money, no favors called in, no desperate last-minute deals had been enough to save him. The system he had spent his life manipulating had finally turned against him, and now he was just another inmate awaiting transfer. Judge Naomi Carter sat in her chambers, the weight of the trial still lingering in her mind. She had presided over countless cases before, had seen corruption, greed, and injustice play out in ways that would haunt the average person for a lifetime. But this case had been different. This case had not just been about fraud or financial crimes. It had been about power, about the way it was wielded and abused, about the people who had spent their lives believing they could buy their way out of anything. Cameron Steele had walked into her courtroom convinced that the rules did not apply to him. Today, she had proven him wrong. Yet there was no sense of triumph in her victory, no celebration in watching a man fall, no personal satisfaction in seeing the gavel come down. Justice was not about revenge. It was about restoring balance. It was about ensuring that the scales could tip in favor of those who had been silenced for far too long. Beyond the courtroom, the consequences of Cameron Steele's downfall rippled outward. His name became synonymous with corporate greed and checked corruption. His trial sparked nationwide conversations about wealth, privilege, and accountability. It became a case study in law schools, a rallying cry for activists demanding stricter regulations against predatory business practices, a symbol of what could happen when people refused to look the other way. But perhaps the most profound impact was not on the news, not in the legal community, not even in the financial sector. It was on the people whose lives he had upended, the families who had lost their homes, the retirees who had lost their savings, the small business owners who had been crushed under the weight of his greed. The funds recovered from his assets, while not enough to undo the damage completely, gave them a chance to rebuild. For the first time in years, they could see a future beyond the ruins he had left behind. Weeks later, an op-ed was published in Maidano, a local newspaper. It was written by Sofia Martinez, Angela's youngest daughter, the same girl who had spent nights sleeping in the back seat of a car because of Cameron Steele's schemes. The piece was short, but its impact was undeniable. "Thank you for standing up for my family," it read. "Thank you for showing us that people like Cameron Steele can't get away with hurting people like us. You didn't just give us justice. You gave us a second chance." The word spread far and wide, reaching the eyes of people who had never set foot inside that courtroom, who had never even heard the name Cameron Steele before his trial. But now they understood. Now they saw what had been at stake. Now they saw what justice could look like. And for the first time in a very long time, the people who had suffered under his greed could finally breathe again, because justice had been served. Cameron Steele's downfall was more than just the collapse of a billionaire's empire. It was a reckoning. A moment that proved, against all odds, that power and privilege were not enough to escape accountability forever. For years he had built his fortune on deception, exploiting the most vulnerable, believing that money would always shield him from the consequences of his actions. And for a long time, he was right. He manipulated the system, bought influence, silenced critics, and walked freely while others suffered. But in the end, it wasn't his wealth or connections that defined his legacy. It was his arrogance. His unwavering belief that he was untouchable became the very thing that led to his fall. His refusal to stand for Judge Carter was symbolic of a much deeper truth. He didn't believe he had to respect authority, especially not from a black woman. He believed the system worked only for people like him, and that belief blinded him to the reality that justice, when pursued relentlessly, could still prevail. Judge Naomi Carter's unwavering commitment to the law was a reminder of what true justice should look like. She did not waver in the face of power. She did not bow to pressure. She did not allow herself to be intimidated by a man who had spent his entire life bending the world to his will. She stood firm, not just for the victims in that courtroom, but for every person who had ever been told that justice wasn't for them. Her ruling sent a message far beyond the walls of her courtroom. It told every corrupt businessman, every corporate predator, every individual who believed they were above the law that their time would come. That money could buy lawyers, but not always freedom. That wealth could silence some voices, but not all. That no matter how much power they held, there would always be people willing to fight back. But perhaps the most important lesson in this story wasn't about Cameron Steele, or even Judge Carter. It was about the people he had wronged. The families who had been forced onto the streets, the retirees who had been robbed of their futures, the small business owners whose dreams had been crushed beneath his greed. Their stories, their voices, were the true force behind this trial. Without them, without their courage to speak out, to fight back even when the odds were stacked against them, Cameron Steele would have walked free. Their resilience was a testament to the power of ordinary people standing up against extraordinary corruption. The case also served as a stark reminder of how deeply injustice can be woven into the fabric of our systems. It wasn't just Cameron Steele who had failed these people. It was the institutions that had allowed him to operate unchecked for so long. How many banks had looked the other way when processing his fraudulent loans? How many politicians had accepted donations in exchange for ignoring his predatory practices? How many people in power had seen the warning signs and chosen to remain silent because it wasn't their problem? The truth is, Cameron Steele didn't act alone. He thrived in a system that rewarded greed and punished those who couldn't fight back. And while his sentencing was a step toward accountability, it also highlighted the urgent need for systemic change. If there's one thing to take away from this story, it's that justice isn't just about what happens in a courtroom. It's about people refusing to accept corruption as inevitable. It's about holding the powerful accountable, even when they seem untouchable. It's about making sure that the next Cameron Steele doesn't get the chance to destroy lives before anyone decides to take action. And most importantly, it's about recognizing that true power doesn't belong to the wealthiest. It belongs to those who refuse to be silenced. What do you think? Do you believe justice was truly served in this case? Or do you think the punishment should have been even harsher? Comment number 1 if you believe Cameron Steele got what he deserved, or tell us what you would have done differently if you were in Judge Carter's position. And if you believe stories like this matter, if you believe in the power of justice, accountability, and fighting for what's right, make sure to like, subscribe, and share so more people can hear these stories. Thank you for watching, and remember, justice isn't just the responsibility of the courts. It's something we all have to fight for every day. Stay strong, stay informed, and until next time, take care.